Most people saw a monster when they looked at Kang Dae, but to Stephanie, he was just the regular who tipped in $100 bills and liked his coffee black. But today, the air in the diner felt like a tomb. As she reached out to straighten his crooked silk tie, a small habit she'd formed to keep him lingering, she saw it, a thin copper detonator wire peeking from his driver's sleeve through the window. Her pulse turned to static. If she spoke, she was a dead woman, but if she stayed silent, he was a ghost. She leaned in, her fingers trembling against his collar as she whispered into his ear, "Don't look at the car. Your driver has a time bomb. If you step outside, you're dead." Kang Dae didn't flinch, but his dark eyes locked onto hers with a terrifying intensity. A second later, the street turned into a furnace of orange flame as the car exploded, shattering the storefront and raining glass like diamonds. He tackled her to the floor, shielding her body with his own. In that fire, her life as a waitress ended, and a war against a terminal diagnosis and a traitorous empire began. Now, before we go any further, I need to tell you something. This story? It doesn't go where you think it does. There are twists coming that will completely change how you see everything you just watched. So if you want to know the full truth, and trust me, you do, make sure you're subscribed. Because if you click away now, you'll regret it. The smoke still tasted like burnt coffee and melted plastic when the first heavy boot kicked Stephanie's front door off its hinges. She didn't have time to scream before a wall of black-clad men swarmed her tiny living room, their rifles pointed at her chest like accusing fingers. These weren't just police. Among the blue uniforms were men with cold, empty eyes who moved too quietly, scrubbing the surfaces of her home with chemicals that smelled of bleach and death. One officer shoved a tablet in her face, showing a grainy security loop of her leaning into Kang Dae's ear just seconds before the diner turned into a fireball. To the world, that whisper wasn't a warning. It was a signal for the slaughter. She reached for her phone to call the hospital, but a heavy hand crushed the device into the floorboards, leaving her with nothing but the sound of her own frantic heart. The lead detective didn't ask questions. He made statements that felt like stones being piled on her chest. He told her she was a terrorist, a girl who had sold her soul to a mob boss to blow up a city block. As he spoke, Stephanie saw one of the cleaners tucking a small, silver canister, something that didn't belong to her, into the back of her sofa. It was a setup so perfect it made her stomach turn into a knot of cold lead. She thought of her father, who had died in a cage of false accusations, and the familiar, copper taste of helplessness filled her mouth. Just as the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, the windows of the apartment shattered inward, and a flash of white light turned the room into a blinding void. When Stephanie's vision cleared, she wasn't in the hands of the law, but trapped in the backseat of a car that felt like a rolling coffin made of leather and steel. Kang Dae sat beside her, his suit torn and his skin pale, yet his eyes remained fixed on a tablet showing a live feed of the city hospital. On the screen, men in white coats, men Stephanie knew were killers because of the way they gripped their clipboards like daggers, were stopping at the door to Maya's room. Her breath hitched, her lungs suddenly feeling as tight and scarred as her sister's. Kang Dae barked a single word into a radio, and on the screen, the hospital wall seemed to vanish as a black SUV rammed through the brickwork. Maya was tossed into the SUV like a fragile doll, her oxygen mask swinging wildly as the vehicle sped away from the hospital. Stephanie lunged for the door handle, but the locks engaged with a heavy thud that echoed in her ears like a gavel. Kang Dae didn't look at her. He only watched the tablet as the hospital vanished behind a cloud of dust and sirens. He told her she should be grateful, but Stephanie only felt the stinging heat of tears she refused to shed. He had saved Maya's life, but in doing so, he had stolen their names and replaced them with shadows. The car turned onto a hidden road, climbing toward a fortress of grey stone and glass that looked more like a prison than a palace. The gates to the estate closed with a sound that signaled the end of Stephanie the waitress. Inside, the air was too clean, filtered by machines that hummed with a low, predatory vibration. Kang Dae led them into a room where Maya was already tucked into a bed that cost more than their entire apartment, yet the little girl's face was the color of winter ash. Maya's chest stayed still for too many seconds between every ragged breath, the stress of the kidnap forcing her weak lungs to seize. Stephanie reached for a medical kit, but Kang Dae's hand caught her wrist, his grip like a band of heated iron. He pointed to the television on the wall, which was just beginning to play the breaking news. On the screen, Stephanie's apartment building was a pillar of orange fire, the top floor exploding in a spectacular burst of light. The news anchor announced that the terrorist waitress had likely died in the blast along with her accomplice sister. Everything Stephanie had ever owned, the photos of her mother, the nursing books she had saved years to buy, the tiny height marks on the kitchen doorframe, was now smoke. She looked at her hands, which was stained with the soot of a life that no longer existed. She was a ghost walking in a dead man's house, and the man beside her was the only one who knew she was still breathing. Kang Dae stepped closer, his shadow falling over her like a heavy shroud. He told her that she was safe now, but his voice lacked the warmth of a savior. He explained that to the world, Stephanie and Maya Vance were dead, and they would stay dead until he decided otherwise. Stephanie looked at her sister, whose monitor was beginning to beep with a frantic, high-pitched warning. The machines were keeping Maya alive, but they were also tethering her to a monster. Stephanie realized that the fire hadn't just taken her home, it had burned away the exit. Maya's eyes fluttered open, but they were filled with a terror that Stephanie couldn't soothe. The little girl reached out, her fingers catching on the silk of Kang Dae's tie, the very thing that had started this nightmare. She asked if they were going home, and Stephanie had to bite her lip until she tasted blood to keep from screaming the truth. There was no home to go back to, only a burning memory and a city that wanted them in chains. Kang Dae looked at the child, his expression unreadable, before turning his gaze back to the monitors that tracked every beat of their stolen lives. He leaned down and whispered a promise that sounded more like a threat. He told them that as long as they stayed in the shadows of the dragon, the fire could never touch them again. But as he spoke, Stephanie saw a fresh drop of blood hit his white shirt, blossoming like a red flower from his own hidden wound. He wasn't just their protector, he was a wall that was slowly crumbling to dust. If he fell, the world that wanted them dead would be waiting at the front door. Stephanie looked at the heavy steel door of the room and wondered if the bomb in the car had been the merciful ending they had missed. The walls of the fortress felt less like stone and more like the cold, white tiles of the police station where Stephanie's father had been broken years ago. Her knuckles turned the color of bone as she gripped the edge of a mahogany desk, watching Kang Dae pace with a predatory limp. He didn't offer comfort. He threw a tablet onto the desk, the screen glowing with a photo of a man she recognized from the diner, Sang Minute, the one who always held the door for the boss. "He was my shadow for 10 years, Kang Dae rasped, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "Now he's the sun that wants to burn us both to ash." Stephanie's stomach twisted into a cold knot, realizing the monster she feared was being hunted by a monster even worse. But if his own shadow had turned on him, who was left to keep the monsters away from Maya? Kang Dae stopped at a bookshelf, pulling a hidden lever that caused the wall to groan and slide open. He didn't lead her into an armory or a vault of blood money, but a room that smelled sharply of antiseptic and old paper. Stephanie's breath hitched, her lungs feeling as tight and scarred as her sister's, as she saw rows of glowing monitors displaying lung scans and genetic sequences. "I didn't want the throne anymore," he whispered, staring at a diagram of a failing human heart. "I wanted to build something that didn't require a shovel and a shallow grave." He tossed a heavy dossier toward her, but as she reached for it, she saw a red light blinking on a security panel. Someone was trying to bypass the outer gates. Stephanie ignored the alarm, her eyes scanning the pages of the dossier as her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every page was a record of Maya's rare illness, but the dates went back months before the diner explosion. She found receipts for experimental lung treatments, all paid in cash by an anonymous donor, the amounts matching the miracle grants that had kept Maya alive. "You weren't a random waitress, Stephanie," Kang Dae said, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying, mournful intensity. "I sat in that grease-stained booth every morning to make sure my investment was still breathing." The revelation hit her like a physical blow, making the copper taste of old trauma rise in her throat. If she was just an investment to him, what happened to the stock when the market finally crashed? She turned a page and found a photograph clipped to a lab report. It was a picture of her father, taken in the prison yard just weeks before he died. Beneath it was a signature from Sang Minute, authorizing the disposal of the witness who wouldn't take the syndicate's bribe. The room seemed to tilt, the whiteness of her knuckles spreading to her entire face as she realized the man who tried to kill her today had already killed the only man she ever loved. "Sang Minute didn't just want my chair," Kang Dae growled, stepping into her space until she could smell the iron on his breath. "He wanted to erase every debt I tried to settle, starting with your father's life." She gripped the paper so hard it tore, a new fire igniting in her chest that felt hotter than the diner blast. But as she looked up to scream at him, she saw the monitors in the room flicker and die, replaced by a single line of text: "The dragon is dead. Long live the king." The silence that followed was heavier than the stone walls, broken only by the sound of Maya coughing in the next room, a wet, ragged sound that made Stephanie's skin turn clammy. Kang Dae reached into a drawer and pulled out a sleek, black drive, his hand shaking so violently he had to steady it against the desk. "This is the ledger Sang Minute killed your father to hide," he said, thrusting it into her palm. It's the only thing that can put him in a cage or under the ground. Stephanie felt the weight of the drive, knowing it was the key to healing the wound her father's death had left in her soul. But the lights in the hallway turned a deep, pulsing red, and the sound of a heavy door being kicked open echoed through the vents. "They're inside," Kangdae whispered, his face turning a ghostly shade of grey as he slumped against the wall. Stephanie realized with a jolt of terror that his final month might have just turned into his final minute. She looked at the drive in her hand and then toward the room where her sister was struggling to draw air. To save the evidence, she would have to leave the man who was currently her only shield. As the heavy thud of boots grew closer, Stephanie realized the secret room wasn't a sanctuary, it was a trap with no back door. The heavy thud of boots against the stone floor echoed like a drum, forcing Stephanie to grip the black drive until the plastic edges bit into her palm. Kangdae didn't look at the door, he looked at her, his eyes cold and sharp like a surgeon's knife. "The police think you're a ghost, and the mob thinks you're a target," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves blowing over a grave. He pulled a heavy gold band from his pocket and slid it across the mahogany desk, the metal clinking with a sound that felt final. "If you're a waitress, you're dead. If you're my wife, you're untouchable," he said, his words a cage she never asked for. Stephanie looked at the ring and thought of her father, who died because he had no name and no power to fight the dark. She reached for the gold, but as her fingers touched the metal, a scream from a hallway told her the monsters were already inside the house. The wedding wasn't a party. It was a battle. Stephanie stood in a room that smelled of expensive flowers and cold iron, her body wrapped in a silk dress that felt like a heavy, golden shroud. Across from her sat the Council of Elders, men with skin like wrinkled paper and eyes that saw her as nothing more than a piece of trash caught in a windstorm. "She is a peasant who smells of cheap coffee and fear," one elder spat, his voice dripping with poison. Kangdae's hand stayed on Stephanie's, but his knuckles were white, and beneath the table, she felt the cold, hard weight of a loaded gun pressed into her thigh. He slid the ring onto her finger, but as he did, the heavy doors swung open to reveal the man who had burned her world to the ground, Sang-Minute. Sang-Minute walked into the room with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, bowing low as if he hadn't tried to turn them into ash just yesterday. "Congratulations to the king and his new distraction," he said, his voice a smooth blade that cut through the silence. He offered a hand to Stephanie, his fingers smelling faintly of the same bleach used to scrub her apartment clean. She didn't pull away, she stood taller, her face turning into a mask of ice that would have made her father proud. "I am not a distraction, Sang-Minute," she said, her voice steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "I am the last person who will ever see your face before you rot." Sang-Minute laughed, but as he turned away, he dropped a small, black lily onto the table, the syndicate's mark for a woman already marked for death. The dinner that followed was a game of knives and lies. Stephanie sat at the head of the table, forced to eat food that tasted like copper while the elders watched her every move. She played the part of the cold, untouchable wife, her eyes never flickering even when a guard's blood stained the white carpet just inches from her feet. Kangdae stayed silent, his face a ghostly shade of grey that told her the cancer was eating him faster than the traitors. During a toast, Stephanie accidentally dropped her silk napkin, leaning down to reach beneath the heavy velvet tablecloth. Her fingers brushed against a small, magnetic device hidden under the wood, a recorder Kangdae had planted weeks ago. She tucked it into her sleeve, but as she sat back up, she saw Sang-Minute watching her with a look that said he knew exactly what she had found. Back in the safety of their room, Stephanie's hand shook so hard she could barely press the play button on the device. The audio was grainy, but the voice was unmistakable. Sang-Minute was talking to a rival boss about the car bomb and the exact moment Kangdae's heart would stop. "The girl is a loose end," Sang-Minute's voice hissed from the speaker. "Kill her sister first, and the waitress will break like glass." Stephanie's breath hitched, her lungs feeling as tight as Maya's as she realized the alliance hadn't bought them time. It had only put them in a brighter spotlight. She looked at the ring on her finger, the gold reflecting the red emergency lights pulsing in the hallway. She turned to tell Kangdae, but he was slumped in a chair, a red stain spreading across his white shirt that wasn't from a glass of wine. The dragon was bleeding out, and the man who wanted his throne was standing just outside the door. Stephanie realized she couldn't be a nurse anymore. She had to be a killer to keep her sister breathing. She gripped the gun Kangdae had left on the table, the metal feeling heavy and wrong in her hand. She looked at the recorder, knowing this proof could destroy Sang-Minute, but only if they lived long enough to show it to the elders. The sound of a key turning in the lock made her skin crawl, and she realized the protection of the marriage was just a fancy way to die in a silk dress. As the door began to creak open, Stephanie didn't hide. She aimed the weapon at the shadow growing on the wall. The rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine was the only thing keeping the silence from swallowing the room, but Maya's chest was barely moving under the heavy silk sheets. Stephanie stood in the doorway, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle of a medical tray, watching the man who had just signed a death warrant for his enemies sit on a tiny wooden stool. Kangdae didn't look like a king. He looked like a ghost, his large frame hunched over a tattered storybook as he tracked the words with a scarred finger. "The dragon didn't breathe fire to hurt the trees," he whispered, his voice a low rumble that seemed to steady the frantic beeping of Maya's heart monitor. "He breathed fire so the small birds would have a warm place to sleep when the winter monsters came." Stephanie felt a sharp pang in her chest, remembering her father's voice doing the same thing before the sirens took him away forever. But as she stepped forward to change the four, she saw a dark bruise blossoming on Kangdae's neck that hadn't been there an hour ago. Maya reached out a thin, pale hand, her fingers brushing the jagged white line of a scar that ran down Kangdae's forearm. "Does the dragon ever get tired of fighting?" she asked, her voice a thin wheeze that made Stephanie's own lungs ache in sympathy. Kangdae didn't flinch. He closed the book and tucked the blanket tighter around her small frame. "The dragon rests when the forest is safe, little bird," he said, his eyes softening into a look so human it made Stephanie's breath hitch. He leaned in closer, promising her the smell of salt air and the sight of the blue ocean by summer, a promise that sounded like a lie in a house surrounded by assassins. Stephanie wanted to believe him, to let the hatred she wore like armor finally fall away, but then she noticed the way his eyes darted toward the security camera in the corner of the room. The air grew heavy with the smell of ozone and expensive cologne as Maya's breathing finally began to even out. "Are you a bad man?" the little girl asked, her large eyes searching his face for a truth that Stephanie had been trying to find since the diner blew up. Kangdae's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping under his skin like a trapped animal, but no words came out of his mouth. He looked at Stephanie, a silent plea for help written in the lines of his exhausted face, and she realized the monster of soul was terrified of a 7-year-old's judgment. She moved to the bedside, her hand hovering just inches above his shoulder, feeling the heat radiating from his body. She hated him for the blood on his hands, but she was falling for the man who was currently the only thing standing between them and a shallow grave. The silence was shattered by a low, metallic click from the hallway, the sound of a weapon being readied. Stephanie's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Kangdae's face transform back into a mask of cold iron in a split second. He didn't move his hand from Maya's grasp, even as he reached behind his back with the other to pull a silenced pistol from his waistband. "Stay with her," he commanded, his voice no longer a whisper but a weapon. He stood up, his body shielding the bed as the heavy bedroom door began to creak open on its hinges. Stephanie looked at the man she was beginning to love and realized that his promise of the ocean might be the last thing he ever said to them. Maya's fingers stayed locked around his thumb, her eyes closing as sleep finally took her, unaware that the winter monsters had reached the door. Kangdae didn't look back as he stepped into the shadows of the room, leaving Stephanie alone with a dying sister and a husband who was a walking target. She gripped the edge of the bed, the copper taste of fear filling her mouth as a red laser dot appeared on the wall right above Maya's head. The light was steady, unblinking, and originated from a vent Stephanie had never noticed before. The dragon was in the room, but the fire was already pointed at the smallest bird in the nest. The cold marble of the kitchen island felt like a slab in a morgue as Stephanie watched Kangdae slide a plate of untouched food toward her. The fortress hummed with the sound of a dozen men breathing behind heavy doors, but in this room, the air was thick with the scent of bitter tea and the iron tang of the weapon resting between them. Stephanie's knuckles were white as she gripped a glass of water, her mind flickering back to the night her father was taken, the same suffocating silence filling their kitchen before the wood splintered. "Eat," Kangdae commanded, his voice a gravelly rasp that didn't hide the rattle in his chest. He reached for the pitcher to refill his own glass, but the heavy crystal clinked violently against the rim as his hand began to tremor, water splashing onto the counter like a leak in a sinking ship. She reached out to steady him, but he pulled back, his eyes flashing with the shame of a king who could no longer hold his own scepter. He didn't offer a towel, he offered a blade, the steel of a small dagger catching the moonlight as he laid it on the marble. "Your hands are for healing, Stephanie, but tonight they must learn to tear," he said, his words a direct hit to the girl who had spent years trying to erase the violence of her past. He stepped behind her, his heat a stark contrast to the chilled air, and guided her fingers around the hilt. His touch was firm, yet she felt the slight, rhythmic hitch in his breathing that suggested his time was leaking out faster than the water on the counter. "Aim for the softest part of the neck," he whispered against her ear, "because the men coming for you don't have hearts to pierce." She adjusted her grip, the weight of the steel feeling like a permanent stain on her soul, but as she turned to face him, a floorboard groaned in the shadows of the pantry. The intruder wasn't a man, but a memory, as a music box in the corner, one of Maya's, began to chime a slow, haunting melody. Kangdae's expression broke, the mask of the monster slipping to reveal a boy who had once scavenged for scraps in the gutters of Busan. "I spent my youth stealing bread and blood," he confessed, his gaze fixed on the moonlight dancing on the floor, "and I spent my adulthood making sure no one could ever steal from me again." He reached for her hand, not to lead her in a dance, but to hold on to the only thing that felt real in a life built on ghosts. They moved slowly to the music, a tragic waltz in the center of a kitchen that doubled as a battlefield, his movements stiff and desperate. For a moment, the blood on his hand seemed to vanish under the pale light, but as he pulled her closer, Stephanie felt the hard, rectangular lump of a tracker sewn into the lining of his silk robe. He was a marked man, and by dancing with him, she was standing in the center of the bullseye. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, the distance between their lips vanishing until she could taste the salt of his sweat. "I don't want to be the dragon anymore," he breathed, the admission a crack in the foundation of his empire. Stephanie's heart hammered against her ribs, the hatred she had nurtured for years finally dissolving into a confusing, terrifying hunger for the man who had ruined her life to save it. Her eyes fluttered shut as his breath hitched, the kiss a hair's breadth away, but the music box suddenly ground to a screeching halt. The silence that followed was sharper than the dagger on the table. Kangdae stiffened, his hand flying to the concealed holster at his hip as the red light on the kitchen security panel turned a steady, blinding green, the signal that the internal locks had been overridden from the inside. He didn't look at her. He shoved her toward the floor just as the overhead lights shattered into 1,000 glass needles. In the sudden pitch black, the only sound was the heavy, synchronized clicking of half a dozen safety catches being released at once. Stephanie reached for the dagger in the dark, her fingers finding only the cold, wet puddle of spilled water. "Stay down, Queen," a voice hissed from the darkness, and it wasn't Kangdae's. A heavy boot landed inches from her face, the floor vibrating with a weight that suggested a man twice Kangdae's size. The smell of bleach, the same scent from her ruined apartment, filled the kitchen, burning her nostrils and making her lungs seize. She heard the wet thud of a body hitting the marble, followed by the sound of Kangdae gasping for air as if his chest had been crushed. The man who had promised her the ocean was being dragged away in the dark, and the only weapon she had was a secret she wasn't supposed to know. The heavy oak door of the war room didn't just open. It groaned as Kangdae staggered through, his fingers clawing at the air before he slammed onto the Persian rug. The three lieutenants stood frozen, their faces turning into vultures as they watched their king convulse. But Stephanie was already on her knees, her nursing instincts overriding the fear that usually kept her spine stiff. She pressed 2 fingers to his carotid artery, feeling a pulse that thrashed like a dying fish, while his skin bled a cold, grey sweat that tasted of salt and iron. "Out. All of you," she barked, her voice a whip that cracked the silence of the room. The men hesitated, their eyes darting to the heavy gold ring on his finger, until Stephanie grabbed a discarded letter opener and pointed it at the lead lieutenant's throat. They retreated, but as the lock clicked, Stephanie noticed the shadow of a boot remains in the door's threshold. She ripped open Kangdae's silk shirt, expecting a fresh bullet wound, but found only the terrifying protrusion of his ribs and a jagged, surgical scar that looked like a lightning bolt. Her hands moved to his waistband, searching for a weapon, but instead, her fingers brushed a cold, metallic case hidden in a secret lining. She snapped it open to find rows of concentrated morphine vials and a crumpled medical report embossed with the seal of a hospital that didn't exist on any map. The word Stage 4 pancreatic cancer screamed from the page, the ink blurred by what looked like dried tear tracks. She looked at the man who had been her shield and realized he was made of glass that was already shattered. He grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly weak, and she felt the vibration of a suppressed cough that brought up a fleck of bright, arterial red. 30 days, he wheezed, the copper scent of blood filling the small space between them. The doctors stopped counting the weeks when the leaves started to fall. He forced himself upright, his spine popping with a sound that made Stephanie's own back ache, and he leaned his head against the cold marble of the fireplace. He didn't ask for a doctor, he asked for his boots, his eyes searching hers for a mercy she wasn't sure she possessed. He admitted the car bomb hadn't been a surprise to him, but a failed mercy kill by a friend who didn't want to see the dragon rot from the inside out. Stephanie felt the weight of her father's death, another man taken by a world that refused to let its victims die with dignity, and her knuckles turned the color of bone as she gripped the morphine case. She reached for a syringe, but a heavy thud against the door signaled that the vultures had finished waiting. "Help me finish the list, Stephanie," he pleaded, his voice a ghost of the roar that had once commanded the city. He didn't want more time. He wanted a clean slate for Maya, a world where the name Vance didn't end in a prison cell or a diner explosion. He reached out to brush a stray tear from her cheek, his thumb rough against her skin, and whispered for her to keep her eyes dry. A dragon doesn't die, little bird. He just becomes the stars that guide the ones left behind, he said, the poetry a stark contrast to the blood-stained floor. Stephanie looked at the door, then at the dying man, and realized she was being asked to be the executioner's assistant. She stood up, the syringe hidden in her palm, just as the door would begin to splinter under a heavy sledgehammer. The lead lieutenant burst through the door, a silenced pistol raised, but he stopped when he saw Stephanie standing over perfectly composed Kangdae. Kangdae sat in his high-backed chair, the morphine having turned his pain into a cold, lethal focus that made the assassin's hand tremble. "You're late for the meeting, Gyro," Kangdae remarked, his voice steady enough to hide the fact that his heart was skipping every third beat. Gyro looked at Stephanie, his eyes narrowing as he realized she wasn't cowering, but holding a medical file that could destroy the syndicate stock price in an hour. The threat was clear, but as Gyro lowered his weapon, a red laser dot appeared on the center of Stephanie's forehead. It didn't come from the door. It came from the skylight directly above the dying king's throne. The walls of the safe house didn't just shake. They groaned as a thermite charge turned the reinforced steel of the front gate into a weeping puddle of white-hot liquid. Stephanie didn't wait for the alarm. She felt the vibration in her teeth, a familiar metallic hum that mirrored the night the sirens took her father. She lunged for the medical bag, but the floor tilted as a second explosion ripped through the library, sending a blizzard of shredded paper and glass through the air. In the flickering emergency light, she saw a shadow dart across the hallway toward Maya's room, a man wearing the syndicate's crest, but moving with the jagged hunger of a traitor. She reached the nursery door just as a black-gloved hand slammed it shut from the inside, the sound of Maya's terrified, wheezing sob cutting through the roar of the fire. Kangdae tried to stand, but his knees buckled, his body finally surrendering to the rot that had been eating him for months. He slumped against the marble fireplace, a spray of bright, frothy blood painting his white silk shirt as a wet rattle took over his chest. "Go," he gasped, the word dragging through the copper-tasting air like a blunt blade. He fumbled for his signature weapon, a heavy, matte black handgun with a dragon etched into the slide, but his fingers were too slick with his own blood to hold the grip. Stephanie looked at the man who had been her monster and her shield, realizing that the wall between them and the grave had finally crumbled. She reached down, her hand steady as she stripped the heavy, blood-spattered black overcoat from his trembling shoulders. The coat was too large, smelling of expensive tobacco and the iron tang of impending death, but as she slid her arms into the sleeves, the weight of it felt like armor. She picked up the dragon-etched weapon, the cold steel grounding her as she looked at the council members through the security feed. They weren't calling for reinforcements. They were standing in a circle, watching the mansion burn on their monitors with the bored expressions of men watching a theater play. They had flipped the switch, trading Kangdae's life for a seat at Sangminit's new table. Stephanie turned to the few loyalists left in the room, men who looked at her with a mix of horror and newfound respect as she racked the slide of the pistol. "The dragon is resting," she said, her voice dropping an octave until it sounded like a ghost's. "But the queen is hungry." She led the men through the servant tunnels, her nursing shoes silent on the stone, her heart fueled by the need to fix the one thing her father's death had broken, the belief that she could save those she loved. They burst into the courtyard just in time to see a black SUV tearing through the wreckage of the gate, Maya's small, pale face pressed against the rear window. Stephanie fired, the recoil jolting through her marrow, but the bullet only sparked off the armored plating of the fleeing vehicle. A burner phone in her pocket buzzed, a single text message appearing on the cracked screen. "The docks. Midnight. Bring the drive or the girl becomes the bait." She looked at the blood on her sleeve, Kangdae's blood, and realized that the man she loved was already dead. She was just waiting for his heart to realize it. The loyalists hesitated, their eyes darting to the burning mansion where the council remained, but Stephanie didn't give them a choice to retreat. She grabbed the lead guard by his tactical vest, her knuckles bone-white as she shoved the dragon-etched barrel under his chin. "Sangminit thinks I'm a waitress," she hissed, the stinging sweat in her eyes turning her vision into a red blur. He forgot that waitresses spend all day watching people's secrets. She knew the old shipping docks better than anyone. It was where her father had worked his last shift before the setup. She jumped into the lead car, the engine screaming as she floored the pedal, but the dashboard navigation screen suddenly flickered to life. It wasn't a map to the docks, it was a live feed from inside the SUV ahead of them, showing Sangminit holding a knife to Maya's throat. He wasn't driving toward the water, he was heading back toward the city's main hospital. Stephanie realized the docks were a distraction, a trick to get her away from the only place that could save Kangdae's life. If she followed the girl, the man died. If she saved the man, the girl was lost. As the car sped toward the fork in the road, the engine began to sputter, and the smell of gasoline filled the cabin. Sang-Minute hadn't just taken Maya. He had cut the fuel lines on every car in the garage. The sky over the shipping docks didn't rain. It wept a freezing, oily sludge that turned the concrete into a mirror of liquid shadows. Stephanie leaped from the sputtering car before it even stopped, the oversized black overcoat flapping around her like a vulture's wings. She didn't look for cover. She followed the sound of Maya's frantic, muffled whimpering coming from a rusted red shipping container suspended 10 feet in the air by a crane. Ahead of her, a wall of Sang-Minute's mercs raised their rifles, but a roar like a dying engine tore through the storm. Kang Dae emerged from the fog, his face a ghostly mask of white skin and red blood, holding a submachine gun in each hand. He wasn't walking. He was a dead man forcing his nerves to fire one last time, a human shield of meat and fury. "Look at me, you vultures!" Kang Dae screamed, his voice tearing his throat until he spat a thick glob of crimson onto the rain-slicked ground. The guards pivoted, their muzzle flashes illuminating the rain like strobe lights as they poured lead into the man who had been their king. Stephanie didn't stop to scream. She used the distraction to scramble up the wet metal ladder of the crane, her fingernails tearing until they bled against the iron. She reached the control booth and slammed her fist onto the emergency release, the shipping container groaning as it slammed onto the concrete with a bone-shaking thud. As she slid down the cable, the copper taste of adrenaline flooded her mouth, but a cold shadow stepped out from behind the steel. Sang-Minute stood over the fallen container, his designer suit untouched by the mud, holding Maya by her hair as he pressed a blade to her jugular. "The waitress thinks she's a queen because she's wearing a dead man's coat," he sneered, his voice a razor-thin edge of contempt. Stephanie didn't negotiate. She thought of her father's face in the cold morgue and pulled the dragon-etched pistol from the coat's heavy pocket. She fired twice, the bullets punching through Sang-Minute's chest and throwing him backward against the steel. He slumped down, his eyes wide with the shock of being killed by help, but his dying hand managed to trigger a remote detonator tucked into his belt. The container didn't just explode. It turned the air into a wall of white heat that threatened to swallow Maya whole. Stephanie lunged forward, her arms outstretched, but a massive weight slammed into her back, throwing her and Maya into the freezing harbor water. As she broke the surface, gasping for air that tasted of salt and gasoline, she saw Kang Dae standing on the edge of the pier, his body riddled with a dozen glowing entry wounds. He wasn't screaming anymore. He was smiling, a faint, bloody curve of the lips as he caught the final volley of bullets intended for the water. He fell in slow motion, his eyes locked onto Stephanie's until the darkness of the water claimed him. Stephanie dragged Maya onto the rusted ladder, her muscles screaming as she hauled them back onto the pier where the silence was now absolute. The mercs were gone, fled into the night, leaving only the burning wreckage of the syndicate's last stand. She looked at the gold ring on her finger, now scorched and dull, realizing she was the only one left standing in a graveyard of kings. She reached into the overcoat's pocket and found the drive, the one thing that could rebuild a world or burn it down for good. But as she gripped it, a familiar red laser dot appeared on Maya's chest, originating from a police helicopter hovering just above the smoke. The sirens began to wail, a sound that usually meant help, but to Stephanie, it was the herald of a new cage. She stood over the edge of the pier, looking down into the black water where Kang Dae had vanished, her knuckles turning bone white. The voice of the lead detective boomed over megaphone, calling her a murderer and a thief, demanding she drop the weapon. She looked at Maya, whose breathing was now a steady, quiet rhythm for the first time in years. Stephanie didn't drop the gun. She turned toward the light, realizing the dragon hadn't just given her his coat, he had given her his teeth. The antiseptic bite of the hospital's intensive care unit felt like a cold blade against Stephanie's skin, a sharp contrast to the smoke and salt of the docks. She sat behind a reinforced glass partition, her eyes fixed on Maya, whose chest rose and fell with a rhythmic, mechanical perfection she hadn't seen in years. The transplant had been a success, bought with $1 billion bribe and a dying man's last drop of political leverage. Beside Stephanie, Kang Dae lay in a motorized chair, a ghost draped in a black silk robe, his breath sounding like dry glass rubbing together. He didn't look at the monitors or the doctors. He only watched Maya's pink cheeks, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the glass. "She breathes because you didn't blink," he whispered, a thin line of dark blood leaking from the corner of his mouth. Stephanie wiped it away with her thumb, but as she did, she felt the sudden, terrifying stillness of his pulse beneath her skin. He didn't die in a bed of wires and beeping alarms. He waited until the sun broke over the hospital's private rooftop garden, a place blooming with the white lilies Maya loved. Stephanie held him as the morning light turned the city's skyline into a crown of gold, his weight becoming heavier with every passing second. He didn't give her a final command or a list of enemies. He simply pointed at the framing of a new hospital wing rising across the street. "Build a world where no one has to straighten a monster's tie to survive," he rasped, his eyes finally losing their lethal spark. Stephanie felt the heat leave his body, her knuckles turning white as she gripped his hand, the same hand that had once been a weapon and was now just cold clay. She thought of her father's lonely grave in the prison yard and realized that for the first time in her life, a man she loved had died in the light. But as the nurses approached to cover him, a man in a grey suit stepped out of the shadows, holding a legal folder that suggested the dragon's debts weren't all settled in blood. 1 year later, the smell of cheap coffee and grease was a distant memory, replaced by the scent of lavender and fresh rain at the entrance of the Dragon's Rest. Stephanie stood at the podium, her black suit tailored to a razor's edge, her face a mask of stone that hid the girl who used to flinch at loud voices. She looked out at the crowd of dignitaries and families, seeing Maya standing in the front row, her lungs healthy enough to let her scream with joy on a playground. The multi-billion-dollar empire Stephanie now commanded wasn't built on fear, but on the legitimate foundations Kangdae had spent his final month scrubbing clean. "We don't forget the fire," Stephanie said into the microphone, her voice steady and sharp as a scalpel. "We just use it to keep the next generation warm." She stepped down to a roar of applause, but as she reached the car, her head of security leaned in to whisper that a crate of black lilies had just been delivered to her penthouse. The penthouse was silent, the walls decorated with art that cost more than the diner she had once scrubbed, but the most important piece was behind glass in her study. It was the silk tie from that first morning, the one she had reached out to straighten before the world turned into a furnace. She traced the fabric with her finger, remembering the copper taste of fear and the way Kangdae had looked at her like she was the only real thing in a world of ghosts. She wasn't a waitress anymore, and she wasn't just a survivor. She was the architect of a legacy that Sang Minute could never have understood. Maya ran into the room, her laughter bright, clear sound that echoed through the marble halls, and jumped into Stephanie's arms. "Is the dragon still watching the birds, Stephanie?" the girl asked, her eyes reflecting the city lights. Stephanie looked out the floor-to-ceiling window at the stars beginning to puncture the dark velvet of the Seoul sky. She thought of the morphine, the blood on the white shirt, and the slow-motion fall into the black water of the docks. She realized that her need to heal her father's memory had finally been satisfied by saving the man who had been his opposite. She tucked Maya in, her hands no longer shaking, her heart no longer a trapped bird. She walked back to the framed tie, the gold ring on her finger catching the light one last time. She whispered the truth into the empty, quiet room, a final tribute to the monster who had chosen a different path. "He taught me that even a monster can choose to be a hero," she said, her voice a soft but unbreakable vow. "And even in the deepest darkness, we can choose to be the light." Here is the outro and final call to action, designed to be delivered with a mournful yet hopeful tone to maximize the emotional impact on your audience. The outro. Tempo, 0.9x slow, deeply emotional and resonant. 1.0s pause. Stephanie and Maya didn't just survive, they became the living proof that the worst day of your life can be the foundation of a legacy. Kangdae began as a monster in the eyes of the world, but he ended as a hero in the heart of a child. It's a reminder that we are not defined by the shadows we come from, but by the light we choose to carry forward. Even now, in that quiet hospital garden, the white lilies still bloom, a silent tribute to a dragon who gave everything so a small bird could finally fly. 0.5s pause. Stories like these are heavy. They remind us of the sacrifices made in the dark so that we can walk in the sun. If Stephanie's courage or Kangdae's final sacrifice touched you today, then you're exactly why I tell these stories. We are a community that believes in the power of the human spirit, even when it's broken. Final CTA. The payoff. Tempo, 1.0x normal, sincere and community-focused. I want to ask you something. If you were Stephanie, could you have forgiven the monster? Or would you have walked away from the fire? Drop a single word in the comments that describes what you're feeling right now. I read every single one of them. And if you want more stories that don't hold back, that go to the deepest, rawest parts of the soul, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell. It's the only way to make sure you're here for the next journey. Thank you for staying until the very end. Thank you for feeling. Until next time, remember, even in the deepest darkness, you can choose to be the light.